The Wyoming wind moved like an old memory across the grasslands, carrying with it the faint sweetness of sun-baked hay and the ache of something unfinished. It was late afternoon at the station, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and iron, and the horizon burned like a forge. The light lay long across the platform, turning the train tracks into lines of gold in every sound, the hiss of steam, the rattle of a trunk, the distant lowing of cattle, into something sharp enough to feel. Caleb Whitmore knelt slow upon those sun-bleached planks, his back stiff, his jaw rough with days of silence. Before him stood Elliot, a small ghost in a pink bonnet and calico dress, her freckled face holding questions that he was too afraid to answer. She clutched a threadbare teddy bear, as if it were the only anchor in a world adrift. The ranch lay miles behind them, an ocean of pale wheat and weathered fence posts that ended in the blue blur of the mountains. For all that space, Caleb felt smaller than the dust under his boots. The station was alive with the coming and going of 1,000 lives, but he had gone still inside. He had once been a pillar of the valley, a rancher with a wife, Sarah, whose presence filled their home like a warm lantern. Then came the sudden silence of the sickbed, the empty chair at the head of the table, and the circle of tongues in town that grew sharper with every passing season. He had let the Wyoming winters carve him hollow, until he was nothing more than a mechanical man tending to a mechanical life. He reached out a hand, his fingers grazing the rough wool of Elliot's sleeve, but he couldn't find the words to bridge the gap. It was then, in the heavy golden hush of the departing train, that her voice broke through the armor he had worn for years. "You don't have to cry, sir," the child whispered, her eyes seeing the tears he thought he'd buried beneath the dust. The Wyoming wind didn't just blow across the Whitmore ranch, it vibrated through the floorboards like a low, grieving hum that never quite found its rest. Caleb Whitmore woke before the sun had even thought to touch the Bighorn Peaks, his movements practiced and joyless. There was a grim rhythm to his life, a clockwork of survival that demanded he be more machine than man. He pulled on his boots, the leather stiff and unyielding, and stepped into a kitchen that felt too large for the two souls inhabiting it. The silence was a physical weight. It sat heavy on the cast-iron stove and coiled around the legs of the dining table. Most of all, it lived in the chair at the far end, the one with the hand-carved spindles and the slight scuff on the left rocker where Sarah used to tap her heel while she mended socks. Caleb didn't look at it, yet he felt its presence like a bruise. To look was to acknowledge the hollow space in the air where her laughter used to be, a sound that had once acted as the heartbeat of the house. Now the only sound was the scrape of his own chair and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock, counting down hours that felt identical to the ones that had come before. Outside, the frost clung to the pump handle, biting into his palms as he drew water for the stock. He moved through the chores with a mechanical precision that left no room for thought. He threw hay to the cattle, his pitchfork rhythmic and steady, a silver arc in the pre-dawn gray. He mended a section of the north fence, his hammer strikes echoing across the grasslands like distant gunfire. Every action was a wall he built between himself and the memory of the fever that had stolen the light from his home. If he kept his hands busy, perhaps his mind wouldn't wander to the cottonwood tree where the earth was still fresh, or to the way the circle of tongues in town grew louder with every week he spent in isolation. He returned to the house to find Elliot standing by the window, her small frame silhouetted against the rising gold of the Wyoming sun. She didn't speak. She had learned the language of his silence well. She simply held her teddy bear closer to her chest, her eyes tracking a hawk circling high above the pastures. Caleb watched her for a moment, the rough calluses of his hands itching to reach out, to offer some comfort he no longer felt he possessed. But the mechanical grind claimed him again. He turned to the stove to start the coffee, his movements stiff and certain, while the grass outside bowed under the wind, whispering of a life that had once been full of sound, but was now only the long golden ache of a man trying to outrun his own ghost. The platform at the railhead was a transition of grit and gold, a place where the wide, lonely Wyoming sky met the rigid iron geometry of the tracks. Caleb stood among the stacks of weathered trunks and heavy leather satchels, his long black coat catching the dry heat of the afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of coal soot and sun-baked timber, a heavy atmosphere that seemed to press against his chest. Nearby, the locomotive groaned, a great black beast venting white plumes of steam that blurred the horizon, turning the distant figures of travelers into shifting shadows. Caleb felt the vibration of the metal beneath his boots, a restless hum that mirrored the frantic, unspoken thoughts he kept locked behind a jaw rough with days of neglect. He looked down at Elliot. She was a small, vibrant splash of calico and pink against the monochromatic dust of the station. In her arms she cradled the teddy bear with a fierce, quiet devotion, its glass eyes reflecting the same golden light that caught the brim of her bonnet. She looked up at him, and for a moment the vastness of the prairie seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them, framed by the iron rails and the weight of their shared history. Caleb's heart, which he had tried so hard to keep still, began to ache with the pressure of everything he couldn't say. The apologies for the coldness of their house, the fear that he was failing her, and the raw, stinging memory of the woman who should have been standing there with them. The sun hung low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the planks, turning the world into a series of sharp edges and deep ambers. Caleb felt the heat prickle at the corners of his eyes, a sudden treacherous moisture that threatened to betray the stoic mask he had worn since the funeral. He knelt then, the wood of the platform creaking under his weight, his tall frame folding until he was eye level with his daughter. He reached out to steady her, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near her shoulder. The station's clamor, the shouting of conductors, the clanging of bells, the hiss of the engine seemed to fall away into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. In that hollow space, Elliot leaned forward. Her voice was no louder than the rustle of dry grass, yet it carried the force of a landslide. "You don't have to cry, sir," she whispered. The word "sir" cut deeper than any blade, a reminder of the distance he had built between them, but the kindness in her eyes was a light he couldn't turn away from. The dam of his emotional exile didn't just crack, it shattered. Standing there amidst the lost things and the departing souls, Caleb realized that while he had been busy guarding his heart against the wind, his daughter had been the only one brave enough to stand out in the storm. The dust hadn't even settled from the wagon tracks before Caleb felt the intrusion. He was out by the barn, oiling a harness with a ferocity that served as a substitute for thought, when the rhythmic clip-clop of a steady bay broke the silence of the afternoon. It was Thomas Reed, a man whose skin was as weathered as the siding of Caleb's barn, and whose eyes held the weary patience of someone who had seen too many winters. Thomas didn't climb down right away. He sat atop his seat, letting the horse blow, his presence a quiet challenge to the fortress Caleb had built around the ranch. "Fence looks good, Caleb," Thomas called out, his voice gravelly but kind. Caleb didn't look up. He kept his focus on the leather, his thumbs worked deep into a stubborn crease. He didn't want the neighborly talk, the soft-pedaled pity, or the smell of a man who still had a hearth fire burning bright at home. He wanted the mechanical grind, the safety of the work that didn't talk back. Thomas eventually climbed down, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He walked over to the barn door, leaning against the frame and casting a long shadow over Caleb's workbench. "I saw you at the station yesterday." Elliot looked like she'd grown an inch just since the spring thaw. He paused, waiting for a hook that Caleb wouldn't provide. "I'm heading into the high country to check on some strays tomorrow. Thought I'd swing by and take a look at that windmill of yours. Sounded a bit hitched when I rode past last week." Caleb finally stopped, the oilcloth gripped tight in his fist. His pride surged, a hot, defensive flare in his chest. "Windmill's fine, Thomas. It's been pumping water since before Sarah passed, and it'll be pumping long after. I don't need a hand with my own steel." The words were sharper than he intended, a jagged edge meant to keep the world at bay. He felt the weight of his own silence, the "sir" from the station still ringing in his ears, making him want to push everyone away before they could see the cracks in his foundation. Thomas didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, reaching out a calloused hand to steady himself against the workbench. He left it there for a moment, a bridge offered in the form of rough skin and honest labor. "Independence is a fine thing, Caleb, until it starts to look like a cage. The valley's talking, and they aren't as patient as the rain. You don't have to carry the whole sky on your shoulders just to prove you're still standing." He patted the bench once, a hollow thud that echoed in the quiet barn, and turned back toward his wagon. Caleb watched him go, his heart hammering against his ribs, the silence of the grass returning twice as loud as before. The boardwalks of the town were a gauntlet of averted eyes and muffled conversations, a place where the circle of tongues spun its webs in the shade of the general store's awning. Caleb walked with his chin tucked, his boots striking the wood with a rhythmic hollow thud that seemed to announce his morning to everyone within earshot. He held Elliot's hand a little too tightly, guiding her toward the mercantile for the salt and flour that his pride demanded he procure himself. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a man whose very presence reminded the valley of the fragility of their own happiness. The bell above the door gave a sharp, silver chime as they entered, but the air inside was different from the dusty heat of the street. It smelled of dried lavender, roasted coffee, and something sweet, like apples stored in a cool cellar. Behind the counter stood Margaret Lan. She was not a woman of loud laughter or frantic movement. She moved with a calm grace that seemed to settle the restless energy of the room. When she looked up, her eyes didn't hold the pity Caleb had come to loathe. Instead, they held a steady, quiet recognition, as if she were looking at a man rather than a tragedy. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore," she said, and her voice was a melody he hadn't realized he'd been starved for. It wasn't the jagged, forced speech of the ranchers, or the hushed tones of the gossips. It was a sound that belonged to a world where the sun did more than just burn the crops. She leaned over the counter, her gaze softening as it landed on Elliot. "And who is this traveling with you? She looks like she might be in need of a peppermint, if her father allows it." Caleb felt the breath hitch in his throat. He watched as Margaret reached into a glass jar, her fingers nimble and sure. She didn't treat Elliot like a burden or a curiosity. She treated her like a child. For a fleeting second, the suffocating weight of the ranch, the empty chair, the silent kitchen, the mechanical grind, seemed to lift. Margaret's smile wasn't a challenge to his grief. It was an invitation to remember that the seasons did more than just die. They turned. He managed a nod, his jaw loosening just enough to let a word escape. "Thank you, Miss Lan." As they left the store, the sunlight on the street felt a little less like a furnace, and a little more like a promise. He looked down at Elliot, who was carefully unwrapping her candy, and for the first time in a year, the wind didn't feel quite so empty. The calico hope Margaret had offered was small, but it was enough to make him wonder if the blue blur of the mountains might hide something other than shadows.